Hello, my name is Ricardo Fernandez.
My name is David Travers.
I'm Emma Gary.
And today we'll be talking about Pittsburgh in the Civil War, specifically three main aspects that affected the city during this time. We'll start with the Northern nationalism, which was sort of the driving force that affected the city.
Going to talk about a little bit of industry, a little bit of pollution, and a lot about unions.
And we'll also be looking at different political events and figures from Pittsburgh. First, we will start with Ricardo and nationalism.
When studying the Civil War, many people tend to think of the Southern nationalism, with good reason. However, what many people don't realize is that there was also Northern nationalism, this pride and utter distaste of the South. This is seen in Pittsburgh. In 1861, the Daily Pittsburgh Gazette wrote an article called The Cost of Disillusion, which states how for 10 years they have been compromising, and that now they felt that the South needed to compromise. This was of the first denouncements of the South. The first action came when Secretary of War John Floyd tried to move a bunch of arms foreshadowing the secession. With pressure from Pittsburgh, Attorney General Edwin Stanton, who was also a Pittsburgh lawyer, asked Floyd to resign, and Floyd obliged. So in these two events, we see Pittsburgh getting early victories for the Union before the war even began. When the war begins, however, this nationalism is seen with the number of troops that volunteer. Now, in the early war, Abraham Lincoln and the federal government thought that this would be a fast war, so they only asked for the loyal states 75,000 troops. Yet Pittsburgh almost shattered their quotas. They were only asked for 3,000 troops, and they ended up giving 11,000 troops, which allowed the whole state of Pennsylvania to double its quota of 14,000. Even though so many troops volunteered, they didn't need them all. What they did, instead of just going home and waiting for their chance, they stayed in Pittsburgh. Since they were not enlisted, they didn't get federal benefits or even salaries. They just stayed there waiting to be called upon. Which leads to the establishment of Camp Wilkins, which was led by Pittsburgh and sponsored by Pennsylvania Governor Curtin, where they were fed, clothed, and entertained by the townspeople. Now, this was state-funded, not federal-funded, so what had happened was surprising, where the people took responsibility and made donations, they raised their own money. So these men who they saw as making a sacrifice for the Union were as comfortable as they could be. And while Camp Wilkins was a military program, there were also a lot of social programs. So these social programs include driven by this nationalism that the civilians felt. So other than Camp Wilkins, they had Mess Hall, which could feed almost 1,200 people per day. Women also had big changes in their roles. They organized this home system where soldiers could be homed outside of Camp Wilkins, which housed almost 80,000 soldiers at least one point during the Civil War. And then also women saw more job opportunities as nurses. Since the demand was high, hospitals were turned into military hospitals, and they were ran by women. The need was so great that nobody objected to this. Even in death, the soldiers were kept in the minds of citizens of Pittsburgh, along with their children. Pittsburgh really pressured the state government to fund education for orphaned kids, and at the state's expense, order the bodies to be brought back all the way from wherever they died and buried. So his feelings of nationalism really led the civilians to do right by the soldiers, who had given so much.
We have Pittsburgh, one of the few places Thomas Duvall stopped on his journey. He didn't really deign to mention it really at all, except in passing, and to also mention that it was dirty. Now, Pittsburgh was quite a polluted city simply because it was the center of the building industry before the Civil War, and even during the Civil War, total production value of the goods coming out of the factories in Pittsburgh was in the billions, and that was back in the 1860s. Described at one point by James Parton in the Atlantic Monthly, it was hell with the lid taken off, and as another passerby coming through remarked by the name of Anthony Trollope, I was never more in love with smoke and dirt. This was because 50% of glass and 40% of iron in the entire country was made solely in Pittsburgh. Some of the biggest companies in there was the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Companies, which was one of the largest manufacturers of rails, as well as they would run coke factories to make the coal. And they would end up shipping these goods up the Allegheny River when it was completed. In the 1850s, about 1858, the Lackawanna Coal Company started converting to steel, which to start with was a very inefficient process. They would lose most of the raw materials, or the steel would come out imperfect, and that would end up causing massive slag heaps around Pittsburgh, which would once again just add to the pollution. But as that slowly started to become more efficient, they started being able to produce steel better. They ended up actually reducing some of the pollutions, but that was not until after the Civil War ended, when they passed the first air pollution ordinance in 1868. Now, in regards to the Civil War, Pittsburgh was crucial to the Union production value, because some would argue that the Civil War was won simply because the Union could outproduce the South. Reasonably, if you look at statistics coming out of Pittsburgh, that's believable. All the railways in the Civil War, the rails were coming from Pittsburgh. The Union had the railroads. They were able to transport troops around. When Sherman went on his march in 1864 through the South, he started tearing up all the rail lines in the South. They called it Sherman's Knot. He'd rip the rails out, heat them up over a fire, and then bend them around a tree. The South obviously couldn't unbend them because they were massively knotted iron beams, and they couldn't produce them because all the rail production was up in the North, and the North was most certainly not trading with them. As a matter of fact, the anthracite furnaces of Pittsburgh were at that moment producing 57% of the nation's national iron output. During this time, 1860s, late 1850s, because production started ramping up for the war, there was a mass influx of workers, specifically immigrants, to Pittsburgh. And in this case, it was almost reverse discrimination, as the English, the Welsh, and sometimes experienced Americans would get jobs, which is unusual because most of the time it was just the Americans who would get the jobs because they're Americans, and all the immigrants would get the bottom. But the interesting thing was that the English and the Welsh would get the jobs in the factories and get the better paying jobs because they came from countries that had started this industrialization before the U.S. So the Welsh and the English, they knew how to work their way in the iron factory, considering the U.S. might have stolen a few of their ideas from the mill town and brought them over. So as these workers started increasing, massive buildups of housing around Pittsburgh, pollution started increasing. The founders of these companies started backing away because of how big their operations got. They hired managers and really sort of removed themselves from the operations. They let the managers run it and basically viewed these workers as tools. They were able to be replaced. When they started making budget cuts for the war because the production, they couldn't get as much iron mines, people were getting drafted. Instead of just trying to slide the pay scale or accommodate the workers, they just fired them. The workers ended up starting unions because of just how poorly they were being treated, and they were arguing for sliding pay scales, and ultimately they ended up establishing one. It was one of the largest unions in the country in 1862. They ended up establishing a sliding pay scale, so as the price of iron rose and fell, their pay rose and fell, but at the same time they were guaranteed job security. Just completely laid off, and which ultimately meant they would have been drafted. And that's all I have.
Pittsburgh was a city that had significant political events happen during the time of the Civil War. Before the Republican convention in Philadelphia and leading up to the next presidential election, the Republican Party had a meeting to clarify the organization's beliefs. They did this because the party had been created out of smaller political parties, including the Whigs, Free Soilers, Northern Democrats, and some others. They wanted to make sure that they were all on the same page when it came to what their beliefs were. At the meeting, the committee kept a record called The Official Proceedings of the Republican Convention. In the opening pages, it read, "Chairman of the state's Republican committees hereby invite the Republicans of the Union to meet an informal convention at Pittsburgh on the 22nd February, 1856, for the purpose of perfecting the national organization and providing for a national delegate convention of the Republican Party at some subsequent day to nominate candidates for the presidency and vice presidency to be supported at the election in November 1856. This book is a record of what the committee discussed, and some of those discussions included sentiments of farmers and the Constitution concerning slavery, the Missouri Compromise, the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico, the invasion of Kansas, and actions of general government, to name a few. These things were all topics of the time that were important to the Republican Party. The convention lasted 2 days and took place at Lafayette Hall in Pittsburgh. Lafayette Hall was not the only historic landmark in Pittsburgh that had political significance. The the Monongahela House/Hotel was also very significant. Abraham Lincoln stopped there between February 14th and 15th, 1861, and gave a speech there during his inaugural journey. He arrived late the first night and did not give a full speech, but on arrival said, "I could not help thinking, my friends, as I traveled through the rain through your crowded streets on my way here, that if all that people were in favor of the Union, it can certainly be in no great danger. It will be preserved." The next day he gave a full speech at the hotel that aimed to keep the country calm, because his speech was given shortly before the separation of the country because of the Civil War. Later at the Monongahela House/Hotel, where the Republican committee members met on February 21st in 1856 to decide how the proceedings of the informal convention would go. They decided that there would be one representative from each state. Pittsburgh was also politically involved even after the war had ended because of the impeachment trials of Andrew Johnson. They were involved in this because their representative, Thomas Williams, was appointed as a prosecutor. Williams had been a lawyer before he worked in Congress. He represented the 23rd District of Pennsylvania, which included the city of Pittsburgh. When Williams originally became involved in politics, he was a member of the Whig Party. Once the Whig Party joined the Republican Party, Williams joined and became a radical Republican. The trial against Johnson started on March 30th, 1868. The prosecution charged Johnson with 11 articles of impeachment and attacked on two main points: violating the Tenure of Office Acts by removing Edwin Stanton, who had been the Secretary of War, and that Johnson had deliberately abused his power during office. During the trial, Williams said, "For this he has invaded the rightful privileges of the Senate by refusing to send in nominations of officers appointed by him during the recess of that body, and after their adjournment reappointing others who had been rejected by them as unfit for places which they had been appointed." This is one example of Johnson abusing his power that Williams pointed out during the trial. On May 26, 1868, the trial ended with Johnson staying in office after the Senate did not achieve the two-thirds majority necessary to convict him. Pittsburgh was more than just a dirty city that revolved around the building industry during the Civil War. Pittsburgh was a city that had political gusto and a strong sense of nationalism.